Good evening. I'd like to welcome everyone to the third lecture in the SCI-Arc Spring Semester Lecture Series. An apt title for tonight's lecture, I think, would be Food for Thought. Our speaker this evening will certainly give us food for thought. I think that the work of C.J. Lim is extremely provocative in terms of how we can deal with some of the most pressing contemporary issues in terms of resource management, the future of our cities, emerging new cities, what the definition of the city could be, might be, possible fictions and possible realities coinciding in this work of how we think about the built environment and how we think about nature, how we problematize those categories. I know that many studios and seminars here at SCI-Arc are actually working on a lot of issues that are related to these topics, so I think it's really fantastic that we can share some of C.J. Lim's very unique vision and very provocative ideas on these subjects. C.J. Lim is the professor of architecture and urbanism and served as vice dean at the Bartlett UCL, University College London. He's also the founder of Studio 8 Architects, an international award-winning practice in urban planning, architecture, and landscape. His teaching and design focuses on multidisciplinary, innovative interpretations of cultural, social, and environmental sustainability programs. Commissioned by the British Council in the UK for the Venice Architecture Biennale, his celebrated project, Virtually Venice, was an investigation of East-West cities, cultures, and identities, and his recent award-winning Smart Cities are for the Chinese and Korean governments. He's the recipient of the Royal Academy of Arts in London Grand Architecture Prize. His authored books include Smart Cities and Eco Warriors, short stories, London in 2.5 Dimensions, and Food City, published by Routledge. I love the titles of those books. Food City is the follow-up to Smart Cities and Eco Warriors. It explores the issue of urban transformation and how the creation, storage, and distribution of food has been and can again become a construct for the practice of everyday life. Global in scope, the lecture and book address the frameworks of over 25 cities through the medium of food and how the city is governed. Food City investigates the reinstatement of food at the core of national and local governance through a piece of polemic titled The Food Parliament. How it can be a driver to restructure employment, education, transport, health, culture, communities, and the justice system. Reevaluating how the city functions as a spatial and political entity. The work raises serious questions about our priorities and that of our governing bodies, using urban relationships to reframe the spaces of food consumption and production, analyzed through historical precedent, function, and form. So with that, I would like to welcome C.J. Lim to SCI-Arc. Thank you.
Thank you for the kind introduction. And thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. Could you hear me at the back? Can you hear me? Okay, good. I'm absolutely delighted to be back at SCI-Arc. I was here, the last time I was here, I was about probably 3-4 years ago. And so it's such an honor to be back here. Thank you. This is my latest book, and before I start talking about the work, I absolutely have to acknowledge this whole bunch of people that have contributed to it, including sort of not just my team, my research team, but also those who have financially supported the work over 3.5 years. So it took a long time to finish the work, I have to say. It was one of the longest projects I've ever embarked on. I think for me to speak about food and its sort of spatial and urban relationship to, I have to go back a little bit to contextualize it to the early projects in smart cities. The first time I sort of the light bulb sort of switched on the importance of food in the way that we can make architecture and cities was when I first visited China about 12 years ago, when we were invited by the Chinese government to work on a series of projects, urban projects called, they wanted eco-cities. Nobody knew what eco-cities was, so we redefined what eco-cities was, and it was all about how food would choreograph urban spaces. This was the first of many. It was in South China, and you can see all the green areas in the model would be food production. And that was how we started using food to initiate, inspire, choreograph, become a tool to make space. We applied the paradigm of smart city into Western models. This was a retrofitting of the dockside in Nordhavn in Denmark. Okay, back to Food City. Food City is an investigation into the urban consequences of food poetics and transparency. The book combines nostalgia and futurism in a narrative architecture to examine food production in urban environments. I guess I'm an old romantic. I love the idea of combining sort of nostalgia as well as taking a peek into what the future lies ahead in the way that one could design. This is a picture for the carnivores. I'll have a picture for the vegetarians in a minute. Food City investigates the restatement of food at the core of national and local governance, how it can be a driver to restructure employment, education, transport, all the way to justice system, reevaluating how the city functions as a spatial and political entity. It was the first time that we actually thought that there could be an interesting discourse between architecture, space making, urbanism, and management of city with the use of politics. That's a picture for the vegetarians. The book is divided into 9 different chapters. The 9 early chapters were very much work that we sort of data, information we collected over the years. And the first chapter was the relationship between food and business. Saskia Sasson said in her article, The Global Street, urban spaces are emerging as sites of transformation out of the monopoly of the food industry. The city is a space where the powerless can make history. And I think that's a really interesting take. Here, if you look at this picture, most of the people in the picture, they are women folks here. This is a marketplace in Accra. Women play a large role in the formal food industry or the informal side of it. Here, these are women working in Egypt and in India, in Salvador, in South America. In Cork, in Ireland, they take great pride in actually telling everybody that they were the first, through the butter industry, this is the butter exchange building, through the butter industry that they provided part-time and full-time employment to all their women folks there, which empowered them and provided them with financial independence. That was really, really important. I guess, not every city has great legacies and great stories to tell. As you all probably know better than I do, the picture here on the right, on the left here, Detroit has a rather sad story to tell. This is a large food distribution center, which is abandoned completely now due to the downturn of the motor car industry. Whereas the picture on the right has probably a much more positive story to tell. That's Chat Thames in London. And if you ever get the opportunity to get to London, go to Chat Thames. And you can actually, I would say, put your nose right against these walls, these building fabric, and you would smell a piece of history. The smell of spices and sugar and all the kind of exotic fruits that were imported, you can still sniff it. So I love this sort of romantic idea that you can actually smell architecture rather than touch, rather than architecture being tangible. It could be intangible. The food business goes to great lengths to entice you to part with your money here. This is a picture of Venice, Venetia, Las Vegas, not Venice, Italy, that we all know. But having said that, how many of you have been there to Venetia in Vegas? It's very, very real. The sky, the sunset in Venetia is actually more real and more beautiful than the real sunset in Venice itself. So I think that's why, you know, it really tells you how architecture can transport you to exotic places that are that you only could dream about. I'm a great fan of Ballard. I just realized this evening that there was one book I haven't read. Thank you, John, for telling me that. In High Rise, Ballard wrote, "As he sat on his balcony eating the dog, Dr. Lang reflected on the unusual events. With its 40 floors and 1,000 apartments, its supermarket and swimming pools, banks and junior schools, all in effect abandoned in the sky, the high rise offered more than enough opportunities for violence." This picture here is not so much the kind of violence that we know, but it's tension, daily tension, several times a day. This is a market just outside Bangkok in Thailand, where the market would part in the middle, almost like the Red Sea parting. The train will come by, and when the vendors hear the rattling on the railway track, the vendors will move their stalls away. The yellow train comes straight through it, and then once the train has gone, all the stalls come back. I mean, this piece of theater is absolutely amazing. And I would recommend it. You can Google it on YouTube. You know, get it on YouTube. You'll see it, what I'm talking about. It's really fascinating. This is probably a different kind of tension. This is these are buildings in the West Bank where they frequently experience shortage of food. And so the planning authority and the local government there have encouraged buildings with flat roofs. The flat roofs providing extra surfaces for cultivation of vegetables and food source. This one, the tension is with the climate, with the weather. It's in Inuit in Iceland. As you can see, the snow comes up to about this high, actually door high, actually, sometimes. And they have 9 to 10 months of snow. The local authority actually decided, this is when great people think of great ideas, they decided with all that snow, for 9 months, 10 months, they decided to spend a lot of money on indoor ice skating rink. Could you imagine that? Why bother spending good money on something that you do not require? So what happened was that when the building was finished, the community took over the building, ripped everything out, and turned it into an enormous, very, very successful greenhouse to make food, to cultivate vegetables and fruits. Communities go to great lengths to resource food. Here, this is one of the key grain stores in Beijing, in China. All the bags of grains and wheat and beans that you see in the picture, they are not locally produced. They are produced through a scheme called the African-China Friendship Farm schemes, where China would invest money into African farms, and the harvest would then be imported back into China to feed Chinese people in mainland China. I have two concerns about that. One is that there's great shortage of food in Africa, as we all know, but also the carbon footmiles on each grain of rice and bean, you can imagine it, all the way from Africa back to China. So the carbon footprint would be enormous. We couldn't choose the neighbors we have. Sometimes your neighbors would, in this picture on the far right, in Shanghai, for example, they would hang the chicken out to dry with their laundry. Allegedly, if you hang the chicken out there long enough, it will become very crispy. Another type of bird, this is bird here, the pelican. Mr. Pelican in Sydney Harbour Market, which is well known in the zone, in the area, in the region. He would actually whoosh all the other birds away that's trying to steal the catch. Tim Lang, he's the chief advisor to our Prime Minister in the UK on food policies. He said that the notion of food culture is a more robust way of understanding people's beliefs and behaviors regarding food. The concept is central to food and health, and to which ideas about diet will dominate the consumer's mind. I highly recommend all of you to read his book. It's absolutely fabulous. I actually think that we should stop buying meat and we should hunt for it. You might think I'm mad, but I think that will stop us from being indiscriminate about how we consume meat. I think there's too much, it's too easily available, and we don't even know where the meat comes from in most times. In recent years, in the UK and Europe, we had a scandal where you think you're buying a beef burger, but actually the beef burger is made from dead horse. Apparently it tastes quite good. Here, this is a picture, not a sort of old film stock, but actually it was taken about 2 years ago. This is in Denmark, where communities come together on weekends to hunt. And the meat they actually procure through hunting would be what they have for the month. I think it's a much more sustainable way of actually procuring meat. Talking of hamburgers, the picture on the far right, that's a hamburger vendor outside MoMA in New York. I actually think the hamburger inside the big Klaus Oldenburg sculpture is probably more tasty. The picture here on the left is, of course, Florence, and we all know what Florence is known for its wonderful museum, culture, food, buildings, and so forth. But I'm always reminded by this statement. One of the characters in the book and the film said his preferred lunch would be a plate of fava beans, a glass of Chianti, and human liver. I'm sure you all know what that is from. Could you tell me? Huh? Thank you. Talking of eating human liver, these two ladies here, they're not eating human liver at all. They're eating, as you can see, they're eating rodents, rats. Tia Makepa created this image here to remind us about food safety and food security. It reminds us that, if we're not careful, we might end up eating things that we shouldn't be eating. That shows how ill these two ladies are. Look at the skin. For food education, I find it interesting how information, the truth about food is disseminated. So, although food issues relating to food security, agricultural sustainability, diet-related diseases, and social exploitation are of vital importance to the future prosperity of our cities, they are very much underrepresented in the public realm. Most of what we see are these. They are multi-million-dollar advertising campaigns to entice us to part with our money. And it doesn't tell us the full truth about what we consume. The same with architecture. We have architecture by great architects that actually tells us very little, and sometimes a little bit patronizing too. I'm sure you know the picture on the far right, the building by the great Frank Gehry, a fish restaurant in the form of shape, and this restaurant here in Estonia, a breakfast restaurant, and of course you have a frying pan with an egg, a plastic egg on there. So the things that, is that all we can do in terms of architecture in helping to inform the consumers? In Korea, the Ministry of Fisheries spent a huge amount of money promoting fish, of course. They made all sorts of installations from sort of roofs to tents and all that thing in their main public square. I think somebody should have told them that, you know, when they mount an exposition of this kind, they should, with fish, they shouldn't do it in the summer. You could just imagine, I mean, you know, just think about Californian weather and fish outside for a whole week. What would that, the architecture is no longer the fish tents itself, it's actually the pinging smell, the ponging smell. I actually think that, you know, we don't have to go through all those great lengths. What is best is that you know, we should support and encourage greater sort of local vendors and producers of food. Here, this is a picture in Salvador where this chap here could tell us everything. He told me everything about these ladies' fingers. He told, you know, these ladies' fingers are absolutely enormous. They are 3 times the size of what we get in England. And the things that he told me, where it came from, who planted it, in what region, and how his mother and his great-grandmother and his great-great-grandmother, who is already dead, would cook it. So the things that, you know, that is information in itself. And I find that much more interesting than sort of, you know, expensive billboards. I think I have been, you know, and throughout my lecture, you would find that I'm slightly unfair towards the larger food industry. Here, this is a building of the Domino sugar factory. Great piece of architecture, I think, which lies across the Hudson. Or here, these are sort of proof of philanthropy, evidence of philanthropy from another sugar company, Tate & Lyle. This is the Tate building, Tate Modern building in London. It's one of our cultural temples. Without the philanthropy and generosity of the food industry, the architecture, the urban landscape of big cities like London and other cities within Europe will be very different because they do contribute a great deal to the built environment. Other companies, confection companies, which we think are bad to human health, like Rowntree, Joseph Rowntree. Rowntree Company contributes a lot to social housing, for example, and Heinz and other food companies. Do you have Nigel Slater in this country? Probably not. Nigel Slater is a famous writer, cookery, presenter on TV, and I love his writing. He's incredibly witty. Here he wrote about Hanover Square, but it applies to all public squares and parks, what he said. In Hanover Square, the benches are crowded with office workers. Other people's lunches are always more interesting than one's own. If we were in another country, Italy or Sweden, say, we would be much more open about it, might even strike up a conversation. But this is England. All you get is a little peep, which is true. You know, so the things that, you know, in England, you cannot actually, nobody talks to each other in the park. I mean, if you talk to a stranger, that person will call the police, usually. I think parks and squares are not places where you just have a clandestine relationship with somebody's sort of dried up sandwich. It's a much more important place in the context of human inhabitation. It actually is a very important habitat for bees, for example, to produce concrete honey. Concrete honey is much better quality than honey produced in the countryside because there's not just, in the countryside, there's only sort of one kind of monocrop pollination, but also the more important part of it is that in the city, you're not allowed to spray chemical pesticide. And whereas in the countryside, you spray it, which then reduces the quality of the honey produced. Concrete honey production is really, really popular now in Europe. This is a scene on the rooftop of the Paris Opera House. In many, many public buildings, including earlier on, the Tate Modern, for example, they have a bee farm on top of the rooftop. This is the roofscape of Smithfield Market, the largest meat distribution center in London. And when you go there, I mean, if you ever go to London, I would highly suggest that what you should do is that you should go clubbing through the night till 3 o'clock in the morning, and then you head towards Smithfield Market and visit this wonderful market when the activities all start. The trucks comes in with the animals, the carcass, they start chopping it up, and all these men and women dressed in these sort of clinical suits will turn up, and they will tell you lots of stories. One of the greatest stories that was told to me by this grumpy chap, he wasn't that grumpy, he looks grumpy, was that, animals used to be transported via foot. The farmer has to bring the animal by foot, not by a truck. And farmers get really, really irritated and annoyed and sort of disappointed because the things that when they weigh the cow, for example, the cow would have lost throughout the journey. For every 10 miles they walk, they actually lose about a pound, apparently. So the things that by the time the animal gets there, it will be sort of a trimmed down version of it. Markets are wonderful places. They're wonderful places because it gives employment. It is a heave of activity, great place of knowledge. But these sort of temples are celebration. They are pieces of architectural celebration. This is a building in Barcelona. How many of you have been to Barcelona and might have been to this building? Okay. You went there?
I lived there.
You lived there? Yeah. My God, I'm jealous because I think, the food in the market is probably better than the architecture. No, that's not true. This is a great piece of work by the late, great Enrique Morales, and it's a pretty wonderful piece of architecture. But the food there is pretty good too. Another great market in Rouen, in France. Look at the roof structure. It wants to reach out and really sort of have a discussion with the sky and the sun and say, thank you, sun, for providing all the energy to make wonderful food here. And, I love architecture that celebrates what it actually is doing. In England, unfortunately, I'm not painting a very good picture of England either here tonight. In England, we have these sort of fucking design and build projects that you don't need architects to do. The contractors just build a shed, and this is how our large markets are now. They don't need architects to do it. Architecture that celebrates food, it doesn't have to be expensive. It doesn't have to be designed by a star architect. This one in Cape Town is a wonderful piece of sort of self-constructed piece of built environment, I guess, painted lovingly by the grocer. I think food waste is a major issue. Food waste is a major issue in my country, in your country. About 30% of food produced worldwide is never consumed, and yet, according to reports by the United Nations, about 40% of the world's population face hunger and malnutrition at any one time. So there's something quite wrong with the calculations or the way that we distribute food and the quality of food. This is not the gun. I did not Photoshop it on. This is a scene in Hebron where men and children would actually source for their lunch or dinner. What they find, they will have a meal. What they don't find, they don't eat for the day. Similarly, in this image here in Nigeria, the papier-mâché looking area, they're not papier-mâché, they're bags of rubbish thrown there, dumped by big international hotels. So as soon as this picture was taken, the minute afterwards, it would be filled with people, communities, local communities coming here to source for their dinner and lunch. And it's pretty sad. On a more positive note, we make wonderful pieces of architecture, sometimes not even for human beings. Here, these are pigeon towers in Isfahan in Iran. They are absolutely stupendous, magnificent pieces of architecture. Anybody from Isfahan here? Or from the region that have pigeon towers of this sort? I have never been myself. But according to myth and legend, the reason why fruits, especially melons, are the sweetest in the region in Iran is because they fertilize their fields with pigeon droppings. So these pieces of architecture are mainly constructed for the purpose of collecting pigeon droppings, not even for meat or feather. In Egypt here, this is how they make bread on the sidewalk. They actually let it sit by the roads, the pavement, let the dough rise, add a few ingredients like cigarette butts and flies onto it, and you get the best bread in the world. And the thing is that the bread, unless you get diarrhea first, which I did. I really appreciate it when you laugh at my silly jokes. Thank you. If you look very carefully at this picture in Mumbai here, a family preparing a meal, I think it's, lunchtime it was. There's nothing really wrong with it. Okay, they don't have a very slick, sort of modernized kitchen worktop unit. But what is really, really fatal in this picture is this. They use this sort of wood and other sort of found material from construction site to burn. And those materials are the key source of lung diseases in third world countries. I was fortunate a few years ago to work collectively with a bunch of biomedics, nutritionists, geographers for a Lancet commission for what they call healthy city, shaping cities for health. And one of the recommendations we made was that governments should engage with informal sector of, for example, market gardeners, as well as sort of the big food industry, to actually create healthy cities. This chap here is an informal food worker. He would produce cheap nutritional food for factory workers, laborers in small towns. This is actually in my village where I come from. I come from Malaysia, in a tiny, tiny village. Probably my village, the size of my village is smaller than, I can't even think of a size. It's tiny. And the thing is that, this is his kitchen here, and he would prepare this food, and he has been doing it on his car bonnet for many, many years. So the thing is that the kitchen doesn't have to be sophisticated in any means. Another small kitchen restaurant, this is in Tokyo. This is probably the smallest kitchen in the world, and the smallest restaurant in the world. You sit here, this measures about 5 meters and less than a meter deep. It's run by these two old guys, collectively aged about 200 years old. And the thing is that if you ever go to Tokyo, please go and eat at this place. They provide food for all the fishmongers, fishermen at Tsukiji Market, the Tsukiji Fish Market, which is a main fish market in central Tokyo. I have to say, I love my Japanese friends. They are all very friendly. But these two guys were not very friendly. They keep saying, no photo there and no photo there. I have to eat many, many bowls of soba and tempura noodles before they allow me to take this picture. From the smallest restaurant to the largest restaurant in the world. This restaurant here in the lagoon in Venice, what I love about it is that this shack here sits about 8 people, and the fisherman chef would drop this contraption here up and down the lagoon a few times, and whatever comes out would be your lunch. I have to say, I didn't enjoy my lunch very much, but what I loved was the theatrics of the piece of architecture. It is magnificent. If you imagine, this is very flat. The lagoon is incredibly flat without sort of buildings blocking your view. So you can see this performance from far, far away. It just reminded me of those stupid projects we do at the Bartlett, which sometimes is incredibly daft. You just think it's not possible, but yeah, this is it. Living proof of a really innovative but slightly silly project. I did not Photoshop all the ducks on either. This is real. This is in China. This is a very normal scene. A very, very normal scene. If you were to drive along some highway in China and suddenly what you get is that you get these flocks of birds sort of crossing the highway. I mean, it makes your freeway here look like an alley, because these highways in China, they are really like 3 times the size of any highway that I've ever seen. And yet these birds just cross it. So the things that, the farmer, Mr. Farmer there, they would take these birds from one lake or one farm, one field to another field for feeding. So that's what they have to do. But I think keeping animals come with also a price sometimes, and it comes with a warning. This is in Africa where, they have this is a scene out, where they had a bird flu. And this is the key reason why we are not allowed to keep birds in general in major cities. I'm sure in your city here in Los Angeles, in London in particular, we are not allowed to keep animals at all, because it's very difficult to control once it actually, the sick animal gets in contact with humans. It could be a real panic situation. Only 2 days ago, it was reported in one of the countryside area, we actually have found proof of illnesses in our chickens. So the things that we will stop eating chickens for a few months now. I think I don't want you to go away and think that I'm the prophet of doom. I'm telling you what not to do, what not to eat, what we shouldn't be doing, in terms of food. I think the reason why food is really important, food and water actually, is important, is because the world's population is going to go over 9 billion by 2050, and 2/3 of the world's population will actually be living in cities. And I can assure you, cities are not ready for that. Not ready because, for food, water, and also sanitation. But sometimes, there's still hope. There's hope in this. This is a picture of hope for me. And it was also the inspiration behind the Food Parliament project. This is what they call the Restaurant Populaire in Brazil. This is in Belo Horizonte. And there are many, many of these restaurants, these sort of urban canteens, dotted around major cities in Brazil. Under Law 6352, every Brazilian citizen is entitled to a nutritious meal a day. The Brazilian government figured out that, it's cheaper and better, politically and health-wise, to feed somebody, to keep them from getting sick, rather than to actually cure them when they get sick later on. So the thing is that this scheme has been running very, very well, and it has actually reduced its national health bill substantially. And I think, this not only serves those purposes, but it also forms an amazing sort of community, social cohesion sort of vehicle. Sometimes law doesn't work at all. So here, these are bluefin tuna, as seen at Tsukiji Market. I would suggest that for all those of us who love our sashimi, please do not order bluefin tuna, because the Japanese government and the American government have refused to collaborate to stop the fishing of these poor creatures. Another great book I would recommend is by Carolyn Steele called Hungry City. Carolyn wrote this when she was living next to a vinegar factory, Sarson's Vinegar. I don't think you have that here, but Sarson's is a very popular vinegar brand. She said that when the wind blew in the right direction, you did not even put vinegar on your chips. When you have fish and chips, you always sprinkle vinegar on it in England. The air did it for you. You could always find your way home in the dark. I love this idea again, the intangible architecture, the intangible yellow brick road, that when you get absolutely completely rat-ass and drunk on Friday and Saturday night, and you could still find your way home because you can smell the smell of vinegar. I love it. This is in Mumbai here. The notion of this incredible transport system that takes food from your home to your office every day on daily basis. So what happens is that this chap will ring your doorbell in the suburb. The meal will be lovingly prepared by your wife, mother, or mother-in-law, ready by about 12 o'clock. and then it will be taken to the city and be at your desk by 1 o'clock sharp. I think it's a bit over the top. I mean, they should just be settled and be happy with a sandwich, but they want hot food in India, I guess. But if you ever have the opportunity to go to a major city in India like Mumbai and Karachi, really you should go to the main railway station, and this is where you would observe this incredible activities. There are thousands of these tiffin carrier gentlemen that actually transport food from the suburbs to the city on a daily basis. Food transportation could always be deemed unethical. In this case, these are pigs here crammed into a truck. As I mentioned, I'm an old romantic. I prefer food to be transported in this beautiful way on canals, on these sampans in Bangkok. These are scenes in the largest food distribution center in Beijing. The food distribution center is enormous. It's a whole township in itself. And it actually takes in all foods imported from all around the world and also within China, and then redistributed. We talked about, I mentioned Cork earlier on, Cork in Ireland with the butter industry. It actually prospered and benefited from that. Here, this is a scene, this is an image of Cape Town, which actually was a beneficiary of what the East India Dock Company created, which brought fruits production in the region. And the built construction, the built environment here is very much the legacy that's left from a very successful fruit industry. That's a small fraction within the book that talks about the kind of research that we found, collated, synthesized. We found a lot of information, and it was very, very difficult, actually, at one point, to then synthesize it and turn it into ingredients that we could use on a polemic and speculative design project. So what we did was that we took the vehicle of reconsidering how politics would play a part in it, and we took the Parliament, the Palace of Westminster, as a reference to applying those information that we found. This is the Palace of Westminster. I'm sure all of you would have come across, and this is the parliamentary building. This is the Big Ben. This is a food parliament. This is our food parliament. The food parliament is a fictional supreme food legislative body for London and its territories. Reimagined as a landlocked sovereignty city-state, it is approximately 3.15 kilometers square, overlaid onto an existing city. It's a secondary infrastructure, and it functions as a holistic ecology. And it have this kind of constant dialogue programmatically and spatially with the London below. So what you have is that you have London, and then the food parliament sits above it. These are the various layers. Just to clue you into the characters, this is Big Ben, and I'm sure you said, Big Ben, you just said it was a tower. Big Ben here is a horizontal piece of landscape. This is Mr. Speaker here. This plate here is Westminster Hall, and I will introduce other characters as we go along. And before I forget, this is the Thames River, which is turned into the Lord Mayor. These are some of the inspiration for the project. This painting by Charles Cockerell, it's called Tribute to Sir Christopher Wren. Sir Christopher Wren was a very famous architect for London, and many of London's landmarks were designed by him, including this wonderful building, St. Paul's. And this painting here has his other sort of spiral-inspired creation sitting at the bottom of St. Paul's. They're not all built there, but he collaged all his buildings together into one. Other inspiration would be Bucky Fuller's Domino in Manhattan, a piece of infrastructure that choreographed a microclimate within Manhattan. And of course, the great late John Haydock's Victims, where each of the tectonic characters in Berlin have almost function as a human being. But the greatest inspiration, and he has always been my guardian in terms of design, has been this cartoonist. He was most prolific between the two world wars. His name is Heath Robinson. He wasn't an architect, but he was incredibly architectural and spatial in his creation. I love this one here. This is a section of an apartment where this chap, he wasn't invited to the party, so he was just sleeping. Look at the section of the floor. It's made of pillows, mattresses, and then to actually make sure that there's no noise, the feet have these sponges wrapped around their shoes, and then they're all tethered to one music source. And I think that's incredibly inventive of him. Like many projects that we do, I mean, we just don't start and then finish, and then something else starts. I think there's always this continuation of dialogue that, creative, intellectual dialogues that transpires from one project to another. This was my previous book called Short Stories, London in 2.5 Dimensions. Here we were investigating the value of context and imagery and how the symbolism would inform architectural programs and tectonics. Back to the Food Parliament. There are 3 key pledges here. The Food Parliament aims to promote the city as the world's leading international center of excellence for food security. It facilitates local communities and individuals in cultivation, processing, and distribution of food. But the most important thing would be it aims to disseminate the notion of new wealth. The notion of new wealth has nothing to do with the money in your wallet, your purse, your bag. It has all to do with nutrition, good health, green space, and fresh air. The Food Parliament is a transformational tool to reveal London's potential response to the omnipresent energy crisis and contributes to the discourse around food poetics and urban food utopia. The functionaries of the UK's supreme legislative body are transfigured into tectonic analogues, responsible for tabling and implementing the new Acts of Parliament. So, for example, the Member of Parliament, the MP, is not a human being. Its characteristics, its duties are transformed into architectural programs to make the piece of architecture or the urban device. I'm going to take you through almost like a guided tour around the Food Parliament. If you ever go to London, I would suggest that you should go to have a guided tour around the Real Parliament building too. It's a great piece of architecture. So, to clue you in, this is the Food Parliament. This is London here. That's the Gherkin, the Norman Foster Tower. That's Westminster Hall Plate. And that's the Ministry of Defense down here. Pretend you are the insect, so you're guiding yourself through it. This is Big Ben, Mr. Speaker, the pyramidal structure that will be growing, cultivating food, Ministry of Defense. This is the real Ministry of Defense. In our case, it's a hybrid between 2 things. The goose, which in farms in England, we use them instead of dogs, and the marigold plant. They use marigold in Havana, in Cuba, for example, because they are very successful in their urban agriculture in the city. They're not allowed to spray pesticide, chemical pesticide. With this plant, marigold has a scent that insects do not like. Other insects absolutely hate it. So the things that it stops butterflies and other pests from eating up your cabbage and other plants. So we hybridize the 2 things together to create these series of structures here. And this armada of this army protects the city, the food city. It becomes the first line of defense to the rest of the city. This is the urban banqueting hall, the pyramidal structure for food production. These are the urban blankets. So when the insect approaches the city, the Ministry of Defense get very, very excited. It starts hissing and spraying. We don't like to kill the insects, so what we thought that we would actually hiss and spray the insects with the marigold scent and keep it in an eternal coma. Underneath the main plate and between these existing buildings is the blue carpet. The blue carpet is the urban fish farm that exists on the flat roofs of London. And so from the upper infrastructure, you can actually have these holes cut out and fish. It's, you have them in the fjords in Norway, in the lakes, where you cut out frozen ice and start fishing. You have it in Tom and Jerry. What we wanted to do was that we wanted to bring back the romance of fishing rather than this trawler fishing that we have now. The romance of fishing that you get in China, in Korea, where you use the bird to fish. The different layers. So fishing from above, the bottom of the urban banqueting hall. This is actually a very long table. And that's the red briefcase, which is the food storage system. I'm sure you're not familiar with this. This is inside the Parliament House. We have two or three parties. That's 1, 2, 3. They sit, they debate, they shout at each other, they want to kill each other. And Mr. Speaker here is this man with a great voice, or before that was a woman with a great voice, to keep peace in the House of Parliament, the House of Commons. He would say, order, order, when things get a bit rough and a bit rowdy. In our case, Mr. Speaker also must have that presence. So the inspiration for that were these sort of agricultural machines that has these great arms that reaches out. And Mr. Speaker keeps not just peace, but transparency and within this food parliament. Transparency is very important. It would actually spray water to wash off any dirt. I think the dirt is metaphoric as well as literal. A few years when we were working on this project, the inspiration came when this thing happened, actually. It was discovered that our members of parliament voted in by the public have been misusing public funds for their own indulgences. So it was, many of them were actually sent to jail. As you can see, many of our drawings are not your traditional plans or sections. They were drawings that look into spatial and programmatic relationship between 2 or 3 different characters. And sometimes the scale of it, they are distorted in the sense that, for example, here, this is the entire city, the food parliament, London beneath that, but yet Mr. Speaker is drawn much, much larger, including its spraying antennae, to emphasize the kind of authority that Mr. Speaker, as an architectonic element, would possess. That's Mr. Speaker spreading across the Thames, crossing the Lord Mayor and Big Ben. Mr. Speaker spraying and cleaning Westminster Hall. Westminster Hall. This Westminster Hall is known for its amazing coronation banquet. This is a scene in 1685, a place to eat. In our Westminster Hall, we didn't want it to be a place to consume, but a place to cultivate, to produce food. We wanted to recreate this majestic quality of a space above the Parliament with these high structures that actually, these pyramidal structures that cultivate, and at the top of it would have Victoria Towers. Victoria Tower is a water container that actually harvests moisture from the air. The pyramidal structures were very much inspired by these spices, that scenes from markets that you will find in North Africa, for example. Going back to this is London here, this is Westminster Hall. The Bucky Fuller Dome of Manhattan was the inspiration to this relationship. Here, because of this big infrastructure, one could choreograph sort of light, shadow, humidity, temperature, rain, and so forth. These are the pyramidal structure. And if you're underneath the city on the street level, you can photograph it from, this is what you see from underneath. Spraying water within the structure to grow, seeding of the plants. This is kind of like a worm's eye view, which is I guess not very fashionable these days. During the days when I was a student, this is like 100 years ago, you know, the great James Stirling would draw these sort of worm's eye views, and I love them. The plants growing, harvested. The section through the pyramidal structure. We went on this crazy thing. We calculated how much would be produced and how it would be distributed. The MP, the Member of Parliament, with its toupee. That's a toupee. You can tell that I have very little respect for our members of Parliament. The toupee is a connection between the pyramidal structure and ground. It would transport food. The toupee stuck through the pyramid. The gathering of the community. Victoria Towers, as I said, you know, Victoria Towers with the water tank and these antennae to harvest moisture from the air. To be honest, I have no clue how much water one would harvest in central London through the air. But it doesn't matter. What we wanted to do was to serve as a reminder the importance of water in cities, now and in the future. Because water is going to be very, very expensive. Water will be more expensive. Potable water, non-contaminated water, will be more expensive than anything else we could ever imagine in time to come. Mr. Speaker, floating above nervously, the pyramidal structure, Foster's Gherkin. St. Paul's Cathedral. And harvest time, food parcels were lowered down into the city. I always think that this looks like a Christmas card drawing. Lowering parcels down into the city below. Food will be distributed amongst those who worked, and then taken towards the urban banqueting hall, which consists of very, very long tables. This was actually a piece in The Independent on Sunday, a newspaper in England, published on 19th October 2014. What was interesting about it was that it's very similar to the urban banqueting hall. They're using this as a vehicle, food as a vehicle to cultivate social cohesion and street events. So it's no different from these long tables here that we created. I like to think that we created it 3 years before they suggested it. And this is the urban banqueting hall right in the middle. Food waste would then be chucked into the Lord Mayor, the River Thames, where it would process all organic waste from North and South London to turn into biogas. Excess food will be stored in the red briefcase. These structures hangs underneath Westminster Hall. It would expand and contract. This is the red briefcase. This is our Chancellor. He's a man with the national budget. He tells us what to spend, how much we can afford, and how much debts we had. And every time he opens his mouth, the stock market will go up and down like a yo-yo. And here, the real tectonic reference is this. This is what you get in sort of northern Spain, Portugal, where they store food, grain, after harvest. They're very tiny lakes to stop animals from sort of getting their hands on food. So these structures hang underneath. And we also have our urban cats to make sure the rats don't get to the food. And each of these red briefcases would hang above a religious building. It doesn't matter if it's a synagogue, a temple, a church, a mosque. And they become the distribution centers. Let me introduce you to the Ministry of Health, which are these urban bakeries. They would bake the pie of new wealth. Remember the notion of new wealth? The metaphoric pie. They line the embankment of the Lord Mayor, the River Thames. The heat from the bakery will be distributed, will be piped back into the city, into these urban blankets. The woolsack, where, remember, London is the opposite of Los Angeles. It's cold and damp and rainy every day, including summer. So the thing is that a warm blanket in the middle of the city with the smell of warm bread would be the most comforting space you could ever imagine, rather than a hard concrete surface. The Ministry of Health would have a really direct, important relationship with the MPs, the members of Parliament. Pies were lined up within the coat of the Member of Parliament. So the pies are hung there for distribution. And then the pies are taken out to the distant constituency, to the suburbs, to the common people by the MPs. When they reach the destination, these totems, these vertical structures, would start to squat down and lower themselves, as you can see here. The main core of it would be the pigeon tower. The pigeon tower, so that's another form of energy that will be distributed to the suburbs. I guess the MP's program is very similar to this piece of infrastructure here in Sydney. That's the Sydney Harbour Opera House. And this bridge here, the Sydney Harbour Bridge, closed one day a year, and it would be decked up, dressed up with AstroTurf, and everybody who is interested in food, from supermarket chains to informal urban gardeners to chefs to nutritionists, NGOs who are dealing with health, they all come here to discuss and celebrate food. So the MP is a piece of tectonic that gathers people together to discuss food politics. The bottom of the MP would have these sort of stacked up chairs. So as soon as it reaches the destination, people will come and grab the chairs, and as the chairs get taken away, the structure gets lowered. and eventually becomes the forum to discuss food politics. And because the pies are low enough, the coat has been hanging low enough, you can reach out and just pluck them. The MP in the context of Westminster Palace. Westminster Hall, Big Ben. This is 10 Downing Street. That's equivalent to your White House. This is where our Prime Minister, Mr. Cameron, would actually preside. This piece of structure has 23 different flaps to the roof because, remember, this is also a provocation and a satire as well. The 23 different roofs represents his 23 different cabinet members, which flap hot air and are useless. The structure also serves as the archive for the manual for the 18 different characters that we have actually designed. So all the manuals of the different kinds will be stored here. The Lord Mayor, the River Thames, the Center for Renewable Energies, we want to celebrate it. As I said, architecture today, especially in England, are no longer a celebration. They're most concerned about how they are very dour pieces of construct. They actually, do not actually represent what they should be doing. Look at these. These are gasometers. In London, once upon a time, they were great pieces of engineering, great pieces of architecture that actually celebrates what it does. So we wanted to bring back this kind of industrial quality. And these are sort of hot air balloons, structures, similar to these that store the gas itself once it's produced. Just to recap here, this is the Lord Mayor, Tower Bridge, the Shard, Mr. Speaker, this is Westminster Hall. These are the relationship between the Lord Mayor and existing London. Big Ben. We all know Big Ben as a tower. But I don't want to be told time through numerical values. I want to bring back the romance of time, the poetics of time in making this piece of architecture, this piece of urban structure. I want it to be this horizontal landscape that tells time through color, texture, and smell. Just like springtime, cherry blossom in Japan, autumn, beautiful golden leaves in Canada. This is the Ministry of Transport. They consist of deers. All the deer in Richmond Park will be used, and they would be the horizontal transport system. A little bit like Santa Claus distributing Christmas presents, but they will also produce organic nutrients for fertilizing crops. All the royal parks and the North Circular Ring Road will be turned into the Ministry of Transport, the habitat for the deer. The vertical system that connects and supports the infrastructure. That's the London Eye. So from the London Eye, you can see the whole development. These are the last few images. We made two enormous models. So there are two layers. The first layer that shows these strips, they are London. This is the red briefcases, the Ministry of Health, the bakeries, and then these are the MPs. So the red briefcase, Mr. Speaker, Ministry of Health, the beginnings of Big Ben, the horizontal landscape. The two models are absolutely enormous, and one of my assistants insists on making the whole thing himself by sticking hundreds, if not thousands, of pieces of card together, and he went crazy afterwards. It's pretty detailed. The upper layer, the second model, that shows Westminster Hall and the pyramidal structure. Thank you very much.